So now let's do a most similar systems design. So again, our research question, our dependent variable is ethnic violence. What accounts for ethnic violence? We've come up with some theoretical answers. The thing that we think is really driving it is poverty, but then there are these other geographical distribution of the minority, size of the minority, institutional incorporation of the minority. What we want to do is we want to find cases where all three of the latter independent variables, I2 through I4, are going to be similar. Okay, and we want to find one, but in these cases, I1 is going to be different. And so let's say I've done my research, I've found a couple cases, and let's say it's France and Germany. Okay, and let's say that in France, you have an ethnic minority that is generally impoverished. Okay, and you have in Germany an ethnic minority that is about on average. Okay. With respect to the second independent variable, go back to I2. The geographical distribution of the minority, largely outside in the countryside, okay, in both France and Germany. Okay, the size of the minority, I3, that's about 15% of the population in both of them. Okay, and I'm just making this up, but I've done my homework, and these are the cases that I've found that are quite similar, let's suppose. And then with respect to I4, let's say that both of them allow for some sort of incorporation. They have special seats for them in Parliament, for example. Okay, so we go and we look at a certain time frame. We say, was there ethnic violence? Now, if at the end of the day we find that there was ethnic violence in Germany and not in France, then we scratch our heads and we say, well, something's not right. Let's go back to the drawing board and let's figure out what's going on here. Because theoretically, there should have been more in France because of this I1. Okay, something else must be going on. So we've got to go back to the drawing board. But if we do find that, sure enough, in France, where you've got a more impoverished minority, we do have more ethnic violence, then we can say, yes, we seem to have support for our thesis, our primary independent variable, that poverty is what drives ethnic violence. Okay. Now, again, keep in mind that you're looking at a variety of different independent variables. These are the ones that I found in the literature that seem to be important, and so these are the ones that I focused on. Okay. Now let's look at a most different systems design. Here we're going to make all the other variables different, except for the primary explanation, the I1. Okay, this poverty thing. So here, let's say I decided to look at France versus Italy. Okay, and in France and Italy, I found that ethnic minorities in both countries were doing pretty badly. Okay, they were both quite impoverished. But I found that the geographical distribution in France, they were living in the countryside, and in Italy, they were living in the cities. The size of the minority, in France, it was about 15%, and in Italy, it was about 30%. Okay, and then the institutional incorporation of the minority, as I mentioned, in France, there were special seats. In Italy, there were no special seats. Now, if I1 is really what's driving this, what we should expect to find are similar levels of ethnic violence in both. Okay, so if we find ethnic violence if we're saying that there's high poverty among the minorities in both cases, we should expect to find ethnic violence in both cases. If at the end of the day we do find ethnic violence in both cases, we can say, great, it's not about geographical distribution, not about the size of the minority, not about institutional incorporation. It seems to be this poverty thing is what's explaining it. Okay. There's evidence in support of our theory. Now, if in Italy we find violence and in France no violence, then again we have to scratch our heads and say something else must be going on, because you have an impoverished minority in each one. Why are they not engaging in violence in France, but they are in Italy? Okay, or vice versa. If you have violence in France but not in Italy, okay, same sort of thing. Okay, so hopefully this is very clear. So that's the most similar systems and a most different systems design. And again, I'll bring up the cautions again. Correlation is not causation. Okay, we could throw in an I5 here. Earthquake-prone countries are more likely to have ethnic violence than other places. Well, this isn't really based on a solid theory. What if, in fact, we found that earthquake-prone countries do have more ethnic violence? Well, unless we have a strong theoretical reason for that, it's probably a coincidence. Right? And the second one is that evidence is not proof. We have evidence in support of something, but we don't, or not in support of something, but we don't prove or disprove anything. Very important. Okay. Uh, let's go on and talk about some methodological issues in comparative politics. There are two basic types of methods people use: qualitative or quantitative. Qualitative studies tend to be in-depth studies of a country or a small set of countries, and these focus on depth over breadth. Now, on the positive side, what they allow you to do is they allow you to go into a nuanced explanation. You can dig into the histories, into the cultures, ensure that you don't have this dilemma where correlation is seen as causation. Let me step back for a second. With the earthquake issue, we could have done a large N study. That means a quantitative study with lots and lots of cases, 120 countries, and found that, sure enough, in a majority of those that had ethnic violence, they also had earthquakes. That doesn't mean earthquakes are causing the ethnic violence. Right? Maybe earthquakes have nothing to do with it. Maybe it's purely a coincidence. Or maybe there's something else going on there where earthquakes lead to a deprivation of public goods, and that's what causes it. But correlation is not causation. So a great thing about qualitative data is you can try to get rid of this correlation equals causation dilemma because you have a much greater understanding. You have your finger on that particular case. You know a lot about it. You've got historical understanding. You understand the cultural context, etc. There are lots of problems, though. First of all, it's time and resource intensive. It takes a lot of money and a lot of time to go off and study these things in each and every country. Okay, you need money for field work. You need to study the language before you get there. You need to study the history of the country before you get there. All these things take time. You're also inherently going to be constrained in the number of countries that you can access, and this is going to make it hard to find ideal cases. Right? There are only so many countries out there. If you need to balance these independent variables, well, you're going to have to look, far and wide for countries that do this, and then you may well have to learn another language in order to do research in that country. Interviewees may also give false data if you're using interviews. They may answer the questions the way they think that you want to hear the answers. Okay, so that's skewed data. Generalizability is also difficult because you're only talking about a couple cases. You can't go to 120 countries, speak 120 languages, and do the same sort of thing, right? So you're talking about a fairly small number of cases. Can we assume that that just because we found that poverty is what explains ethnic conflict in France and Italy, that it's going to explain it in other countries as well, other continents even? Okay, and finally, there's the issue of replication. You're supposed to be able to have a study which can be replicated by someone else and they're going to get the same findings. Well, it's hard to go out and replicate this. I mean, my first book was based on countries including Uzbekistan, Serbia, Croatia, and Poland. Well, who else is going to learn Russian, Uzbek, Serbo-Croatian, and Polish? There are a couple people out there, but what are the chances they're going to call the same people I interviewed, et cetera, et cetera? It's much more difficult. Now, with respect to quantitative studies, here you're using a large set of cases, using really sort of superficial data. Okay, someone's coded this data, they put it into a big data set, and you're going to analyze it. So here you're talking about breadth over depth. And the great thing about quantitative data is it's generalizable, much more generalizable than qualitative data. Right? If we've seen this phenomenon play out in 120 countries, well, we can be pretty sure that it's going on everywhere. Okay, there's also the issue of replication. It's much more easy to replicate this because you can just go off, take the same data set, use the same methods, and bam, you're going to get the same sorts of things. But there are also a number of problems with quantitative data. Okay, you're first of all limited by the data availability. Okay, there are a lot of questions that you're going to ask that you just are not going to find data for. Okay, my research on transitional justice, I wasn't going to find data for that. Most of the transitional justice measures I uncovered in the various countries I was looking at weren't even really reported on in the media or in academic journals. Okay, people just didn't know they happened. Okay, except for the people who were in the countries, and oftentimes even there they didn't know. Okay, so that's one problem. Another problem is that the data sources can be difficult to verify. You don't know who did the surveys. You don't know who did, or you might know, but you don't know that they did them properly. Okay, you don't know who coded things or how they coded these various things. For example, geographical distribution. Where did they get the numbers? Were the numbers accurate? Can we expect to find the same accuracy in Algeria versus in France? Sorry to put those guys together. Okay. So the data can be also skewed. The data is also open to interpretation. Okay. It can give you a false sort of sense of security. The World Bank, for example, a great case. The British ambassador was talking about this a few years ago. How in Uzbekistan, the Uzbeks, were asked for what their economic growth rate was by the World Bank. And the Uzbeks would say, "Well, we had a 6% growth rate." Well, that was BS. And so the World Bank would say, "Well, we have you down for a minus 4% growth rate." And so they would say, well, so here's what we're going to do. We are going to declare that Uzbekistan had what's the difference? 6 to minus 4, had a 2% growth rate. Okay, so is that good sound data? Well, it's not good sound data. But someone who doesn't know anything about Uzbekistan is going to see that the World Bank data suggests that Uzbekistan had a 2% growth rate over the last 6 years. And that's inaccurate. Okay. And finally, there's always the temptation to go on fishing expeditions. Okay. Earthquakes are the answer. Remember, correlation is not causation. People can go through the data without any theoretical rationale, and they can say, hey, look, I'm trying to explain ethnic violence, and I've found that countries that have lots of forests tend to have more ethnic violence. So I'm going to come up with a theory that suggests that there's a good reason for that. Well, that's dangerous. That's not what social science is. Okay. So again, these are things that you need to be careful of. And so there are lots of pros and cons of both qualitative and quantitative data. In the next video, I'm going to start talking about the evolution of comparative politics. So I'll come back to that in a moment.